John Adams was an American statesman, attorney, diplomat, writer, and founding father who served as the second President of the United States from 1797 to 1801. Before his presidency, he was a leader of the American Revolution that achieved independence from Great Britain. During the latter part of the Revolutionary War and in the early years of the new nation, he served the U.S. government as a senior diplomat in Europe. Adams was the first person to hold the office of Vice President of the United States, serving from 1789 to 1797. He was a dedicated diarist and regularly corresponded with important contemporaries, including his wife and advisor Abigail Adams and his friend and political rival Thomas Jefferson. A lawyer and political activist prior to the Revolution, Adams was devoted to the right to counsel and presumption of innocence. He defied anti-British sentiment and successfully defended British soldiers against murder charges arising from the Boston Massacre. Adams was a Massachusetts delegate to the Continental Congress and became a leader of the Revolution. He assisted Jefferson in drafting the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and was its primary advocate in Congress. As a diplomat, he helped negotiate a peace treaty with Great Britain and secured vital governmental loans. Adams was the primary author of the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, which influenced the United States Constitution, as did his essay Thoughts on Government. Adams was elected to 2 terms as vice president under President George Washington and was elected as the United States' second president in 1796. He was the only president elected under the banner of the Federalist Party. Adams's term was dominated by the issue of the French Revolutionary Wars, and his insistence on American neutrality led to fierce criticism from both the Jeffersonian Republicans and from some in his own party, led by his rival Alexander Hamilton. Adams signed the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, and built up the Army and Navy in the undeclared naval war with France. He was the first president to reside in the White House. In his bid in 1800 for re-election to the presidency, opposition from Federalists and accusations of despotism from Jeffersonians led to Adams losing to his vice president and former friend Jefferson, and he retired to Massachusetts. He eventually resumed his friendship with Jefferson by initiating a continuing correspondence. He and Abigail generated the Adams political family, including their son John Quincy Adams, the 6th president. John Adams died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Adams and his son are the only presidents of the first 12 who never owned slaves. Historians and scholars have favorably ranked his administration. Learned and thoughtful, John Adams was more remarkable as a political philosopher than as a politician. People and nations are forged in the fires of adversity, he said, doubtless thinking of his own as well as the American experience. Adams was born in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1735. A Harvard-educated lawyer, he early became identified with the Patriot cause. A delegate to the First and Second Continental Congresses, he led in the movement for independence. During the Revolutionary War he served in France and Holland in diplomatic roles, and helped negotiate the Treaty of Peace. From 1785 to 1788 he was minister to the Court of St. James's, returning to be elected vice president under George Washington. Adams' 2 terms as vice president were frustrating experiences for a man of his vigor, intellect, and vanity. He complained to his wife Abigail, "My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." When Adams became president, the war between the French and British was causing great difficulties for the United States on the high seas and intense partisanship among contending factions within the nation. His administration focused on France, where the Directory, the ruling group, had refused to receive the American envoy and had suspended commercial relations. Adams sent 3 commissioners to France, but in the spring of 1798 word arrived that the French foreign minister Talleyrand and the Directory had refused to negotiate with them unless they would first pay a substantial bribe. Adams reported the insult to Congress, and the Senate printed the correspondence, in which the Frenchmen were referred to only as X, Y, and Z. The nation broke out into what Jefferson called the XYZ fever, increased in intensity by Adams's exhortations. The populace cheered itself hoarse wherever the president appeared. Never had the Federalists been so popular. Congress appropriated money to complete 3 new frigates and to build additional ships, and authorized the raising of a provisional army. It also passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, intended to frighten foreign agents out of the country and to stifle the attacks of Republican editors. President Adams did not call for a declaration of war, but hostilities began at sea. At first, American shipping was almost defenseless against French privateers, but by 1800 armed merchantmen and U.S. warships were clearing the sea lanes. Despite several brilliant naval victories, war fever subsided. Word came to Adams that France also had no stomach for war and would receive an envoy with respect. Long negotiations ended the quasi-war. Sending a peace mission to France brought the full fury of the Hamiltonians against Adams. In the campaign of 1800 the Republicans were united and effective, the Federalists badly divided. Nevertheless, Adams polled only a few less electoral votes than Jefferson, who became president. On November 1, 1800, just before the election, Adams arrived in the new capital city to take up his residence in the White House. On his second evening in its damp, unfinished rooms, he wrote his wife, "Before I end my letter, I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." Adams retired to his farm in Quincy. Here he penned his elaborate letters to Thomas Jefferson. Here on July 4, 1826, he whispered his last words, "Thomas Jefferson survives?" But Jefferson had died at Monticello a few hours earlier. John Adams was many things: lawyer, diplomat, member of the Continental Congress, and one of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence. Adams was born in Braintree, Massachusetts, in 1735. He proposed to Abigail Smith in 1762 and they married 2 years later. The couple had 6 children. On November 6, 1758, Adams was sworn in as a lawyer. Returning to Braintree, he opened his own practice. Stemming from a poor performance in his very first case, the practice, in its first year, 1759 to 1760, suffered. However, with training and time, John was able to refine his skills. As a member of the Federalist Party, Adams decided to run for the presidency. He lost and became vice president to George Washington during both terms, 1789 to 1792, 1793 to 1796. In 1796, he decided to run yet again for the presidency. He won the election and assumed the presidency at the age of 61. In 1796, the United States, with a population of about 4.6 million, was comprised of 16 states in the Union. When George Washington was unwilling to serve a third term, Adams decided to run yet again for the presidency as the Federalist Party nominee against Thomas Jefferson of the Republican Party. The election of 1796 was the first of its kind. It launched the multi-party system, where people could vote for their party of choice. Receiving 71 electoral votes, only 3 more votes than his opponent, Adams won the election and assumed the presidency at the age of 61. The election of 1796 was the only one in which the elected president, Adams, and vice president, Jefferson, came from different parties. Election debates focused on foreign policy, especially how closely to align with Great Britain and France, developing a strong central bank and monetary system, the role and size of the federal government, how to regulate land speculators and private investors, and the civil rights of immigrants. John Adams was in the shadow of George Washington, and he knew it. He served 1 term as president. The true test of his presidency came in the aftermath of the Jay Treaty, which Washington had signed. France felt slighted by the Jay Treaty, believing that it favored Great Britain. In response, France cut ties with America, diplomatic and trade. Related to the Jay Treaty, the XYZ affair involved confrontations with France in 1797 and 1798, which became known the Quasi-War. Much of Adams' presidency was dedicated to dealing with international issues, but he was successful and ultimately avoided war with the Treaty of Montefontaine in 1800. During the election of 1796, the Federalists quickly labeled Adams as a Francophile, giving him the perhaps unearned reputation of being more concerned with the international interests than with domestic affairs. Adams at odds with his own Federalist Party and was often undermined by his own cabinet member, Alexander Hamilton. Adams' characteristic aloofness and refusal to enter directly into political conflict probably cost him his re-election in 1800. John Adams signed the unpopular Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These four pieces of legislation, Naturalization Act, Alien Friends Act of 1798, Alien Enemy Act of 1798, and Sedition Act of 1798, made it harder for immigrants to become citizens as they increased residency from 5 to 14 years, and allowed those considered dangerous to be imprisoned or deported from the U.S. Adams voided former financial loans and rescinded political treaties negotiated with the French. Nevertheless, he managed to avoid a retaliatory war with France through diplomacy. Adams was the first president to take up residence in the President's House, the original name of the White House. In the last year of his term, Adams would move to Washington on November 1, 1800, and lived there for about 5 months. John Adams supported building a strong defense system and remains referred to as the father of the American Navy. Because Adams believed in the elite idea of republicanism and didn't trust public opinion, he was probably one of the most disliked presidents. Adams was left to deal with a major international crisis of the nation related to relations with France. His best legacy is the fact that he avoided war with France. Soon after his return to the United States, Adams found himself on the ballot in the presidential election of 1789. Washington was the unanimous selection of all electors, while Adams finished second, signaling that his standing as a leading member of the revolutionary generation was superseded only by that of Washington himself. Under the electoral rules established in the recent ratified Constitution, Adams was duly elected America's first vice president. This meant that Adams was the first American statesman to experience the paradox of being a heartbeat away from maximum power while languishing in the political version of a cul-de-sac. Adams himself described the vice presidency as the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. His main duty was to serve as president of the Senate, casting a vote only to break a tie. During his 8 years in office, Adams cast between 31 and 38 such votes, more than any subsequent vice president in American history. He steadfastly supported all the major initiatives of the Washington administration, including the financial plan of Alexander Hamilton, the Neutrality Proclamation, 1793, which effectively ended the Franco-American alliance of 1778, the forceful suppression of an insurrection in western Pennsylvania called the Whiskey Rebellion, 1794, and the Jay Treaty, 1795, a highly controversial effort to avoid war with England by accepting British hegemony on the high seas. When Washington announced his decision not to seek a third term in 1796, Adams was the logical choice to succeed him. In the first contested presidential election in American history, Adams won a narrow electoral majority, 71 to 68, over Jefferson, who thereby became vice president. Adams made an initial effort to bring Jefferson into the cabinet and involve him in shaping foreign policy, but Jefferson declined the offer, preferring to retain his independence. This burdened the Adams presidency with a vice president who was the acknowledged head of the rival political party, the Republicans, subsequently the Democratic Republicans. Additional burdens included, inheritance of Washington's cabinet, whom Adams unwisely decided to retain, and whose highest loyalty was to Washington's memory as embodied in Hamilton, a raging naval conflict with the French in the Caribbean dubbed the Quasi-War, and the impossible task of succeeding. No one could replace the greatest hero of the Revolutionary era. The election of 1800 again pitted Adams against Jefferson. Adams ran ahead of the Federalist candidates for Congress, who were swept from office in a Republican landslide. However, thanks to the deft maneuvering of Aaron Burr, all 12 of New York's electoral votes went to Jefferson, giving the tandem of Jefferson and Burr the electoral victory, 73 to 65. Jefferson was eventually elected president by the House of Representatives, which chose him over Burr on the 36th ballot. In his last weeks in office, Adams made several Federalist appointments to the judiciary, including John Marshall as Chief Justice of the United States. These midnight judges offended Jefferson, who resented the encroachment on his own presidential prerogatives. Adams, the first president to reside in the presidential mansion, later called the White House, in Washington, D.C., was also the first and one of the very few presidents not to attend the inauguration of his successor. On March 4, 1801, he was already on the road back to Quincy. Benjamin Franklin summed up what many thought of Adams, saying he means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses. Adams strongly felt that he would be forgotten and underappreciated by history. These feelings often manifested themselves through envy and verbal attacks on other founders. Edmund Morgan argues, Adams was ridiculously vain, absurdly jealous, embarrassingly hungry for compliments. But no man ever served his country more selflessly. Historian George C. Herring argued that Adams was the most independent-minded of the founders. Though he formally aligned with the Federalists, he was somewhat a party unto himself, at times disagreeing with the Federalists as much as he did the Republicans. He was often described as prickly, but his tenacity was fed by decisions made in the face of universal opposition. Adams was often combative, as he admitted, "As president I refused to suffer in silence. I sighed, sobbed, and groaned, and sometimes screeched and screamed. And I must confess to my shame and sorrow that I sometimes swore." Stubbornness was seen as one of his defining traits, a fact for which Adams made no apology. "Thanks to God that he gave me stubbornness when I know I am right," he wrote. His resolve to advance peace with France while maintaining a posture of defense reduced his popularity and contributed to his defeat for re-election. Most historians applaud him for avoiding an all-out war with France during his presidency. His signing of the Alien and Sedition Acts is almost always condemned. According to Ferling, Adams's political philosophy fell out of step with national trends. The country tended further away from Adams's emphasis on order and the rule of law and towards the Jeffersonian vision of liberty and weak central government. In the years following his retirement, as first Jeffersonianism and then Jacksonian democracy grew to dominate American politics, Adams was largely forgotten. In the 1840 presidential election, Whig candidate William Henry Harrison was attacked by Democrats on the false allegation that he had been a supporter of John Adams. Adams was eventually subject to criticism from states' rights advocates. Edward A. Pollard, a strong supporter of the Confederacy during the American Civil War, singled out Adams, writing, "The first president from the North, John Adams, asserted and essayed to put into practice the supremacy of the national power over the states and the citizens thereof. He was sustained in his attempted usurpations by all the New England states and by a powerful public sentiment in each of the Middle states. The strict constructionists of the Constitution were not slow in raising the standard of opposition against a pernicious error. In the 21st century, Adams remains less well known than many of the founders, in accordance with his predictions." McCullough argued that the problem with Adams is that most Americans know nothing about him. Todd Leopold of CNN wrote in 2001 that Adams is remembered as that guy who served a single term as president between Washington and Jefferson. "He has always been seen," Ferling says, "as honest and dedicated, but despite his lengthy career in public service, is still overshadowed." Gilbert Chinard, in his 1933 biography of Adams, described him as staunch, honest, stubborn, and somewhat narrow. In his 1962 biography, Page Smith lauds Adams for his fight against radicals whose promised reforms portended anarchy and misery. Furling, in his 1992 biography, writes that Adams was his own worst enemy. He criticizes him for his pettiness, jealousy, and vanity, and faults his frequent separations from his family. He praises Adams for his willingness to acknowledge his deficiencies and for striving to overcome them. In 2001, McCullough published the biography John Adams, in which he lauds Adams for consistency and honesty, plays down or explains away his more controversial actions, and criticizes Jefferson. The book sold very well and was very favorably received and, along with the Furling biography, contributed to a rapid resurgence in Adams's reputation. In 2008, a mini-series was released based on the McCullough biography, featuring Paul Giamatti as Adams. Adams is commemorated as the namesake of various counties, buildings, and other items. One example is the John Adams Building of the Library of Congress, an institution whose existence Adams had signed into law. Adams is honored on the memorial to the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence in Washington, D.C. He does not have an individual monument dedicated to him in the city, although a family Adams memorial was authorized in 2001. According to McCullough, popular symbolism has not been very generous toward Adams. There is no memorial, no statue, in his honor in our nation's capital, and to me that is absolutely inexcusable. It's long past time when we should recognize what he did, and who he was. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, July 4, 1826. Both were old men. Adams was 90, and Jefferson was 83, and both were ill, though Adams had been in comparatively robust health until just a few months earlier and Jefferson had been ill for an extended period. Thank you for watching this video.